All right. Good evening, everyone. Am I seeing this? Did I do this right? I did. Hello, hello. Welcome to Skeptical Inquirer Presents. This is a series of live online presentations from experts who are devoted to advancing science over pseudoscience, media literacy over conspiracy theories, and of course, critical thinking over magical thinking. My name is Leanne Lord, and I am delighted to be your host. I am a stand-up comedian, author, CFI fellow, and fellow Earth dweller. As I'm sure you all know, today is Invite an Alien to Live with You Day. I think it's a little too soon in our relationship for that. It's National Family Reunion Month, and I think it's way too hot for that as well. That's why I am very much enjoying Air Conditioner Appreciation Day. Whew. Couple of quick reminders for everyone. The Center for Inquiry's podcast, Point of Inquiry, is available wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like to upgrade your beach reading, might I suggest a subscription to Skeptical Inquirer magazine, which is available for everyone at skepticalinquirer.org. And now on to the main event. Tonight's presentation is Why Mass Hysteria is Thriving in the 21st Century. And for clarity, I do not mean the 2019 movie Mass Hysteria, which you can watch on Amazon Prime. I also don't mean Mass Hysteria, the prolific French heavy metal band that formed in 1993 and released 13 albums between 1997 and 2018. Ils sont si bons. Our guest tonight is going to talk with us about his investigation into Havana Syndrome and the bad science behind it. He describes it as a myth that is a product of shoddy science, poor journalism, and bad government, which is quite the trifecta. Hopefully, he'll have a chance to walk us through the history of mass hysteria, or more accurately, mass psychogenic illness, the meowing nuns, the hiccuping schoolgirls, and the claims that Lucky Charms cereal is making people sick. And actually, I believe that one, because Lucky Charms is disgusting. I mean, any self-respecting human being would be eating Fruit Loops. The point is, mass psychogenic, I don't know why I'm stumbling on that word today, psychogenic illness is a thing. And in trying to understand why, we sometimes incorrectly equate it with mental illness or psychological weakness. But our guest tonight is going to help us get a better handle on what's going on. Robert Bartholomew is an honorary senior lecturer in the Department of Psychological Medicine at the University of Auckland. He has written extensively on mass psychogenic illness, hoaxes, popular delusions, and pseudoscience. He has also written on topics that are, shall we say, in the margins of science: UFOs, ghosts, haunted houses, Bigfoot, lake monsters, the kind of stuff that makes you fun to talk about at dinner parties. He is also a certified middle and high school teacher who is taught in the United States. Baloh, we're not sure. The two Roberts are the authors of Havana Syndrome, Mass Psychogenic Illness, and the Real Story Behind the Embassy Mystery and Hysteria. He is a self-described sympathetic skeptic. We are fortunate to have him with us tonight for us and this morning for him. So please welcome to the screen, Robert Bartholomew. Robert, you have the con.
Look, thank you very much. And I guess I'd like to start by saying that human beings are meaning-oriented creatures. We are prone to getting things incorrect. The face on Mars, Percival Lowell, over a century ago, looking at Mars and thinking that he was seeing canals when there weren't canals on Mars. In 1977, Maria Rubio was cooking a tortilla on her skillet in Port Arthur, New Mexico, and thought she saw the face of Jesus. What was it, in the early 1990s? They had, somebody in Florida had was making a grilled cheese sandwich and thought they saw the face of the Virgin Mary. Now, let alone no one knows what the face of Jesus or the Virgin Mary looked like, assuming they are historical figures. But the whole point here is that we are very imperfect in our senses and we're prone to getting things wrong. And that has led us astray in many areas. And so the most recent of my investigations is Havana Syndrome. These reports in Havana, Cuba, that started to emerge in late 2016, where you had these CIA officers who were in a posh neighborhood of Havana. And one of them was walking near their home at night, and they noticed this strange sound in about November of 2016. And they observed that, this is very odd. It's like someone was pointing a beam of sound at my home. And a couple of months later, at the very end of December, that same CIA officer who was undercover started to have hearing problems, a headache, and dizziness. And he went to the embassy clinic and he reported this. These are very common symptoms that people would report to their doctor in any given session. And so, but he noticed something unusual. And he told this to the doctor. He said, it's almost like someone's pointing a beam of sound at my home. And I wonder if that could have caused the symptoms. And they didn't think too much of it. And then a couple of other CIA officers mentioned that they too had heard these strange sounds, like a beam of sound being pointed at their homes. And this folk theory emerged that the Cubans, working perhaps with the Russians or the Chinese, had developed some new secret weapon that was being used to harass American diplomats in Cuba. And you think to yourself, why in the world would they come up with such a far-fetched explanation for this? And it's because, and look, I should point out at this point that mass psychogenic illness often occurs in a context, right? You have to look at the context. It never occurs like individually. People just don't suddenly experience symptoms. You have to closely examine the circumstances surrounding it. In this case, there was a long history of Cuban agents harassing American diplomats in Cuba going back many decades. American diplomats would wake up in the morning in their home. They would go down to their kitchen table and find cigarette butts, and they don't smoke. They would find dog poo on their kitchen floor, and they don't have a dog. You'd wake up and some of the books on your bookshelf have been rearranged. And it was their calling card to let you know that you were being surveilled 24/7. So it was within this context of CIA folklore and CIA history, because all of the diplomats who went to Cuba when Obama opened the embassy in 2015 to renew relations, they had all been told of this long history of Cuban agents harassing Americans over there. And they were told before they went there, you will be surveilled 24/7. And that there was this long history of harassment, and that was very likely to occur. So you've got these people on edge looking for something. So once this happened and the folk theory emerged, then the diplomats were told, you may be the subject of a sonic weapon, because the assumption was that the sound they were hearing in association with their symptoms, that is what was making them sick. So they started to very closely scrutinize their environment. And all these diplomats in the American embassy and also the Canadian embassy, because they were sharing information and intelligence, were going around and they were hyper vigilant for sounds and feeling unwell. So you might hear a sound and then expect to feel unwell, and you would. Or you'd feel unwell and then you'd listen for a sound that was assumed to be making you feel unwell. And this was really scary for the diplomats because they were told things like, well, don't stand or sleep near your windows. And a lot of these diplomats had kids over there as well. So it was a very scary time for them. And so this is the setup. This is the backdrop for the symptoms that spread throughout the American and the Canadian diplomats. And here's all you need to know. The first study that was done on the diplomats, a couple of dozen diplomats in the American embassy, they were told, some of those diplomats, to, once these cases started, to record their attacks. So the first study done on a couple of dozen of these diplomats, 8 of them had recorded their attacks. So they hear the sound, they feel unwell. An advisory panel to the US government looked at those 8 audio recordings and analyzed them. These are some of the best audio people in the world. And they concluded that they were the mating call of the Indies short-tailed cricket, one of the loudest crickets in the world, by the way. And so it is a classic nocebo effect. Now you think, what's the nocebo effect? Well, it's the evil twin of the placebo. We've all heard of the placebo. If I give you a sugar pill, tell you you're going to feel better, often you will. It's the power of expectation, and it's the power of framing. But if I give you a sugar pill, tell you you're going to feel better, and someone comes in and says, oh, I put rat poison in that pill, there's a good chance that within a few minutes you might get a headache, nausea, stomach pain, you might even vomit. But there's nothing physically wrong with you. And you tend to have symptoms that reflect what you're expecting to have. So if you've eaten something and you think you're going to get food poisoning, you tend to have stomach issues. If you think you've been exposed to some type of toxic gas, your eyes might water and you might have breathing problems. So they typically reflect the event scenario. So think of mass psychogenic illness as the placebo effect in reverse. And I'll give you one quick example of this. A while back, there was a man in his late 20s, and he suffered from depression, and he was on an experimental depression medication. He was involved in this study. And one day he had an argument with his girlfriend, and he took something like 27 or 28 caplets that were in the bottle that he had. He took everything. I don't think personally anyone's worth doing that over, but anyway, so he takes the caplets, he's trying to kill himself, and then he realizes, look, I've made a mistake, I want to live. He gets rushed to the hospital. They take him there. He has all these symptoms, extremely low blood pressure. They put him on an IV for the next 4 hours. His symptoms don't abate. And then they finally got a hold of one of the doctors who was involved with the study. He came down to the hospital and he goes, oh, you were in the placebo group. And then within about 15 minutes, his symptoms dissipated and he was back to normal again. His blood pressure went back to normal as well. And it just goes to show you the power of expectation and belief. You know, we can, with the placebo, we can make ourselves feel better. We can also make ourselves feel unwell. So did you want to ask me a question about Havana Syndrome?
Actually, I do. I know we have, there's a question in the box, but I will ask their question first and then mine. Giacomo, if I'm saying that correctly, I'm probably not, wants to know, how did diplomats explain that Cuba's electricity grid is pretty degraded and unlikely to sustain a high-powered sonic beam? How is that possible?
Well, here's the thing. I went to Cuba back in March of 2020. And at the neuroscience center that I was at, the whole center was being run on I think it was a diesel generator. And they made the observation, I think there are no more than 2 working MRIs in the whole country. And on the way to the airport, the taxi had to dodge these carts with loose hay being pulled by donkeys and horses. And it just didn't seem like a country that had developed some new super sophisticated type of weapon. And so, yeah. And look, with the first explanation that came out was it was a sonic weapon. And look, if this were a horse race, the sonic weapon horse would have collapsed on the track just after getting out of the gate, because there's no such thing as a ray gun where you point it at a building and you can target the people inside, right? It just doesn't work that way. It would defy the laws of physics. 99% of the sound waves would bounce off the outer wall. And so, and you'd have to have a massive device anyway, and it wouldn't work. And then people come up with the, oh, it must be a microwave weapon, which wasn't even out there until 2018. And a microwave, if you were trying to target people inside a building, first of all, it would knock out Wi-Fi systems. It would shut down computers, according to experts. And it would literally heat your brain. And look, one of the explanations that has been put forward was it was pulse microwave radiation, the so-called Frey effect. And this is when the microwave hits your head, they strike your head, and they stimulate a nerve inside the vestibular system, and you get the perception of a barely audible clicking sound, but it's not a sound wave. It's not coming through the air like a sound wave, but it's stimulating that creates this perception of a sound wave. Well, first of all, the diplomats in Cuba were not claiming to hear a barely audible clicking sound. That's number one. But it's just not possible. It would defy the laws of physics. And here's the other thing that people often get lost with, and that is in August of 2017, when this was first made public, the Associated Press ran a report about this, and then they received, within a couple of months, they received 36 people contacting them who said that, you know, I went to Cuba over the past few years. I went to one of those hotels where they claimed this had happened to them, and I had something very similar happen to me. Heard this strange sound and I felt unwell. And when that came out, the American officials were asked about what these people should do. And they said, well, they should go to their neurologist and consult them. We're not interested in interviewing them. We're not interested in examining them. My question is, why not? Because if that had been American diplomats, they would have been interviewed and they would have been examined. So there's a real double standard here that's going on. And I should preface by saying the so-called attacks in Cuba, none of them happened at the American embassy. They happened in one of 2 large hotels, an apartment complex, and in people's homes. And the other thing that's important to state here is that what happened in Cuba, you've got the events there, and then you've got this spread around the world. And they're 2 very different things that have been happening. What happened in Cuba is a classic setup for mass psychogenic illness. And I think what's happened around the world is more mass suggestion. And I think, you know, people say to me, they say, well, they've had these studies and they found white matter tract changes and concussion-like symptoms and hearing loss. That's not mass hysteria, but that's not what happened. If you look at the 2018 Journal of the American Medical Association study, the first study done on the diplomats in Cuba, if you look at that study, they were, before that study came out, they were saying things like, in the media, leaking information, that a number of these victims had mysterious white matter tract changes to their brains. But when the actual study came out many, many months later, only 3 people had white matter tract changes. 2 were mild, 1 was moderate. If you were to randomly pick 21 people off the streets of New York City today, you'd have a similar breakdown, because white matter tract changes are common in everything from depression to migraines to normal aging. And then you get people saying things like, okay, but what about the concussion-like symptoms? How can you explain that? The concussion-like symptoms, when you look closely at the brain scans, they were very ambiguous and open to interpretation. And then people say things like, but what about the hearing loss? There never was hearing loss. That's in relation to the so-called University of Miami study from December of 2018. And in that study, even before the study came out, information was leaked to the press that about 1/3 of the patients had hearing loss. But when they actually gave them the hearing test and the study came out, they only found that 2 patients had hearing loss, both of whom had pre-existing hearing loss before they went to Cuba. So how did they report that, or leak to the press, they had hearing loss? Because when they interviewed the subjects, they said they thought they had hearing loss, but at that point, they hadn't given them the hearing test. But when they gave them the basic standard hearing test, they came out as having, except 2 people, the only 2 people that had hearing loss in that cohort already had hearing loss before they went to Cuba. So all these things out there that you see in the media, and it gets reported because it was leaked. And then months and months later, the study comes out and it shoots it down. But the problem is the previous many months have had all these reports out there. And I like to say that I can summarize what's happened in Cuba in one sentence. And that is, when you hear the sounds of hoofbeats in the night, first think horses, not zebras. The doctors at the American State Department went for the most exotic, far-fetched hypothesis early on. They went searching for unicorns when they should have stuck to more mundane explanations. And I should also preface by saying, I think most cases that have been reported aren't mass psychogenic illness. They are simply people who've been told to be vigilant for some kind of an attack, right? So now they're monitoring their bodies very closely. They wake up in the morning and they have a headache or ear pain, and they redefine an array of common symptoms and sometimes not so common symptoms within a different frame, a different expectation. And lastly, the other thing that's very important here, and that is, after this went on for a couple of years, then the American State Department issued an alert for their intelligence officers and diplomats around the world to be on the lookout for symptoms of Havana Syndrome, and which included hearing an unusual noise, having facial pressure. And so they put them on alert. And then in, I think it was September of 2021, the Department of Defense put on alert all their 2.9 million military personnel and contractors around the world to report any unusual symptoms that may have been associated with hearing strange sounds and having facial pressure, or just symptoms in general associated with Havana Syndrome. And now you got over 1,000 people reporting this. But here's the problem. Here are the symptoms of Havana Syndrome: headache, nausea, dizziness, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, disorientation, forgetfulness, confusion, tinnitus, insomnia, balance problems, ear pain, depression. My goodness, these are symptoms. Most of these symptoms are so common as to be experienced by just about every human being who's ever lived in any given week of their life since the time we've lived in caves, right? I mean, and this is the problem. all these ambiguous symptoms. And when you take out claims of brain damage, hearing loss, you really are left with a classic outbreak of mass psychogenic illness. And the last thing I really should point out here is that in 2019, the Journal of the American Medical Association came out with another study, and their study found brain anomalies in a cohort they looked at in Cuba. Well, it's not unusual to have brain anomalies in small cohorts that you look at. Brain anomalies got reported in the media as brain damage. It is not the same. And if you look at that cohort, about a dozen of the Havana diplomats who were examined, about a dozen of them had a history of concussion compared to 0 in the control group. That alone could explain what was going on in terms of the difference between the two groups. And so the unfortunate part was the brain anomalies being reported as brain damage. The study itself said that the anomalies were not so significant. They couldn't rule out the possibility of individual variation. Translation, you have symptoms there that were not very significant. So, and this is the problem, the reporting of these studies and the poor nature of the studies themselves. I mean, there was the study from 2018 from JAMA, which looked at the threshold of impairment for Havana Syndrome. The threshold of impairment for Havana Syndrome in the 2018 study was at 40%. That means there would be billions of people around the world who qualify as having Havana Syndrome. That threshold of impairment should have been closer to 5%. That study was so poorly done that the entire editorial board of the journal Cortex asked for them to clarify their methodology or retract the study. And so, that's why I say, Havana Syndrome is a human creation of bad journalism, bad government, and bad science. And the other observation I'll make is for the bad government, and would have been about September of 2021, Pamela Spratlin, who was the Biden panel head of the investigation into Havana Syndrome. She'd been looking into that for about 6 months now. And she was doing a conference call, a Zoom call, kind of like what we're doing now, with several victims of Havana Syndrome. And one of them noted that, I recently heard that the results of the FBI report have been leaked, and they concluded it was mass psychogenic illness. You don't believe that, do you? And she said, well, I want to keep all options open. Within days, she was forced to resign just because she was holding open the possibility of mass hysteria, mass psychogenic illness. And people were saying things like, I'm not hysterical. I don't have a mental disorder. I'm not crazy. No one's saying, and I've never said that mass psychogenic illness is a mental disorder. I've never called them crazy. Mass psychogenic illness is best thought of as a collective stress response based on a belief. We all have beliefs. Therefore, we are all potential victims. I remember doing an Al Jazeera half-hour TV interview, and the interviewer was saying things like, well, Robert, how do you explain CIA officers and intelligence personnel and diplomats having these symptoms? I mean, these are not the types of people to be experiencing mass psychogenic illness. They're highly educated and sophisticated individuals. No, we are all potential victims. That's like people saying, a police officer saw something happen. They're trained observers. No, eyewitness testimony is extremely fallible and subject to error. It doesn't matter who you are, because we are all human beings.
Robert, there's so much here. I find all of this fascinating. I will say that whenever I hear a strange sound, I always think it's opera, because that is strange to my ears. But when you said that they sent out this sort of directive saying, hey, everyone, beware of this. And so you got people listening for zebras instead of horses. And it feels like it's sort of, they're priming the pump or begging the question or sort of leading the witness, so to speak. Like, hey, if you feel this, this is what it is. And why wouldn't you fall into that response? But
you know what, the real issue here is politics being mixed with science. And
would that explain why that woman was sort of let go from the panel? Because, okay, politics.
That tells me that this investigation is being driven not by the science, because if it's by the science, all things are to be held open and potentially called into question as possibilities. And when you start ruling out things like, well, just because this person is considering the possibility of mass psychogenic illness, they are unfit. That is politics driving the investigation. And now you've got the Biden administration and Congress, right? Congress can't even agree on coming up with legislation to ban assault weapons in the United States, yet they can agree on giving tens of millions of dollars for an imaginary illness that's out there. And it's very ironic to me. And people say, well, how is that possible? How can they possibly be giving all this money out for an illness that, or a condition that doesn't exist, right? Railway spine, back in the mid 1800s, there were all these people experiencing back problems and spinal problems after being involved in train accidents. They were quite common when trains first came out. But they weren't finding the physiological corresponding issue with this. But it was assumed it was there. And now a consensus has emerged that railway spine was really the trauma that had resulted from being in a train accident, but not being severely injured. You got telephone shock and telephone illness when the telephone was first developed, with people reporting concussion-like symptoms, which is one of the so-called symptoms of Havana Syndrome. Telephone operators were claiming to hear, and they were hearing these crackling sounds occasionally on the phone line. And the belief emerged that because it was electronic and people hadn't heard, electronic things before, was somehow making them sick. Look at repetition strain injury in Australia. Why was it concentrated in Australia? We had people doing basically the same thing in other countries, and it wasn't happening to them. It was because they were getting compensation for it, right? And subconsciously, or hoaxing as well. And to the extent that it was called kangaroo paw. But, at its core, Havana Syndrome is a technology scare. It's that some foreign country has developed this new technology. And there's a long history of technology scares, whether it's the telephone, whether it's AM radio, when AM radio first came out in the 1920s and 30s. Many people reported that it was making them sick, these invisible waves traveling through the air that was striking them. Many people thought it was causing weather problems. And so you have this long history. More recently, you have the claims that mobile phones are causing brain tumors. There might be a slight increase there, but if they did cause brain tumors, there would be an epidemic of brain tumors at the present time, right? The claims about Wi-Fi making people sick, 5G. There's a long history here of technology scares, and that's what I see Havana Syndrome. It's nothing new, really, and it's also a kind of a social panic that's going on about xenophobia and a fear of foreigners and foreign governments. The enemy that's out there that wants to attack America.
I have a lot of questions here, and I had this one as well. And Rob, this is from Rob Palmer. Hey, Rob, wants to know that what is it with CBS News and 60 Minutes that they insist on making their reports on Havana Syndrome so one-sided? And that goes to something I heard you say on a podcast, and you've mentioned about other sources. When you hear something from what you believe is a trusted source, and it turns out that it's not right, it sort of shakes your confidence. It's like, well, what can I believe? But specifically to Rob's question about CBS News and 60 Minutes, why was the report so one-sided? I mean, if you can answer that.
Yeah, it's really disturbing because I grew up with 60 Minutes, and it was,
didn't we all?
one of the leading news magazines in the world. They do great work. Not here, not in this case, just like JAMA. JAMA is one of the top medical journals in the world. There's no question about that. But they have human beings as editors. And at 60 Minutes, they have human beings as reporters and producers. And look, 60 Minutes clearly got it wrong. And it's really concerning. Look, I have no problem with them coming out and saying things like, oh, we interviewed somebody who worked in the White House, and they had these strange symptoms when they heard these unusual sounds. And we think it could be a microwave attack by the Russians or some foreign adversary. Okay, fine. But give the other side. And I'll give you an example. There was a diplomat in China, an American diplomat, who claimed that his family had been attacked by some kind of microwave device, comes back to the United States. He's staying in a hotel in Philadelphia, and he's being, him and his family are being tested for potential Havana Syndrome. And one night in his hotel room, he looks at his children. He's got two kids. They're thrashing around in bed. It's like, oh, this is very unusual. My kids are kind of thrashing in bed. And no, there's something called night terrors, which is quite common in children. And anyway, he picks one of the children up, and he said he heard something like a swishing sound, like water running. And then he went to pick up the other child, and the same thing happened. And the implication was that it could have been a microwave attack, when in fact, that is one of the most common symptoms to describe tinnitus. And in fact, there's a tinnitus expert that wrote an article called, "Is that the water running, or is that tinnitus?" And so my point here is 60 Minutes is not stupid. They are very sophisticated, very well educated. And if they were consulting with a neurologist, they would have been tipped off to the fact that there's a really plausible alternative explanation here, not microwaves and not space aliens. It's tinnitus, which is very common. So that's the frustration. And they talked about this woman walking down these stairs near the White House and heard the strange sound and thought she might have been the victim of a microwave attack, right? But here's the thing. She never consulted a doctor or anything about this. And if you think that is the case, or consulted the government about this, it was only later when she heard about this stuff. So retrospectively, things tend to get exaggerated. What's the old saying? The older I get, the better I was, right? And so, and look, the vestibular system is the system that deals with hearing and balance and spatial awareness and differentiation. And most people are experts in the vestibular system. And so this woman had an event, but it's quite common. In fact, ever since I was a young boy growing up on a farm in upstate New York in Whitehall on the base of Lake Champlain, I can remember about once a year, I'd just be sitting there, and all of a sudden, it was like my hearing would drop out for a few seconds, and I'd hear this high-pitched sound. And then it would go away, and I'd forget about it. And it would happen occasionally. And then when I'm doing the book with neurologist Bob Baloh at UCLA Medical Center, I mentioned it to Bob, and Bob goes, "Oh, that's transient tinnitus. Very common." And since then, when I've been teaching, I'll have my students, I'll say, how many people have had that happen to them in the past year? Almost all their hands go up. It's quite common, but it's one of those things where you just kind of forget about it and you don't think about it. Or for example, when I do a lot of work and working heavily, all of a sudden, I'll just kind of like veg out for a minute in my mind. It's almost like my brain is saying, just shut everything down for a minute and just kind of don't think about anything. And there's probably a word for that. And somebody's done a PhD thesis on it, right? But if I'm
going to say you're rebooting yourself.
What happens all the time? What was that?
No, I said, I'm going to say you're rebooting yourself. Your brain just pressed the reset button. That's all.
Yeah. So, you know, if I think I'm the victim of Havana Syndrome, I might think, ooh, that seems a bit more, because you're monitoring yourself more closely, right?
Right.
And that's where this reminds me of something I've done a lot of studies on, and that is Bigfoot sighting waves, UFO sighting waves, chupacabra sighting waves, right? Where ordinarily people just kind of go about their daily business. But if there's been a Bigfoot sighting in your area and then somebody else sights it, what happens? And you get these flaps. People start scrutinizing their environment for evidence of this alleged creature. So now a rustling in the bushes becomes some kind of Bigfoot creature, and your mind fills in the rest, because we're very imperfect at perceiving our world. And the same with UFOs, right? Most UFOs are ambiguous nocturnal stimuli, right? But if you've been told there's people have been sighting flying saucers, now you start to look up in the sky and scrutinize it a bit more. And then it's like, oh, there's an object up there. It changed to red, to green, to white, to yellow, and back to red again. I've never seen that before. Yeah, it's a scintillating star, and it's there all the time, right? If it's not cloudy, you're just not paying that much attention to it. And that's what happens with a lot of these scares and outbreaks, like the mad gasser of Mattoon, for example, in Illinois, where people thought they were being the victims of this gasser. Well, it was chimney flues backing up. It was gardenia flower beds. It was all these things that they didn't ordinarily pay attention to. And so you get these flaps that go on. And the same with the nocebo effect. People start to scrutinize their bodies more closely for symptoms. Mm-hmm. So if somebody said, ooh, you know, what is it? The recent study from Harvard that said over 60% of the side effects reported for the vaccine for COVID are psychosomatic. And so you start, you know, and ordinarily, if I said to you today, you ate for breakfast some Lucky Charms, and and so people started posting to this website, I've Been Poisoned website, that their experiences, and a few started posting about Lucky Charms, and then it turned into a tsunami of people reporting that after they'd eaten Lucky Charms cereal, that they felt unwell. And there was one guy, I think, who posted, and all these postings are on the site, you know, I'm glad the box is empty. Well, if that's the case, why were you eating it, right? I mean,
I'm sorry, that's hilarious. That's a whole list of people who made bad breakfast choices. Oh, okay.
Exactly. Well, if you're eating Lucky Charms, you know, it's not good. It's not a good start to begin with, right? It's not going to be a good.
Not at
all.
Not
going to end well.
I mean, maybe when you're 4, but now somewhere out, you know, after puberty, choose better. Wow.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my God. We have a lot of questions here still, but
Sure.
I'm curious, and this is me. Why is it? Because these are smart people, you know, in many cases, as you say. Is it just a natural human thing that we do, that we are reaching for the fantastical instead of the practical? Is that what's really going on here? Like, ooh, it would be exciting if it were this answer, which is not really likely.
You know what's concerning to me? There's so much misinformation out there. and so little critical thinking in many quarters that many people have stopped searching for information. And instead, they're searching for confirmation and affirmation of their pre-existing beliefs. And there's a term for that in psychology. It's known as confirmation bias, the tendency to seek out information that reinforces pre-existing biases, stereotypes, and beliefs. And it was kind of like what you were saying. You had a really good insight before we started taping here about how people don't change. They're very reluctant to change their views once they've gone on record.
Yes.
And that's a really, really good point. We tend to get caught in just kind of trying to, we're afraid to admit that we could have been wrong and we made a mistake. And you were asking me, why is it that human beings are afraid to admit that? Because we shouldn't, because that's part of the scientific process. It's part of really being a scientist and being objective, to be able to admit that they're wrong. And I would be the first to admit that Havana Syndrome is real if you can find the weapon. But here's the thing. It's very clear that what people have claimed to report is not the case. I mean, these studies with JAMA, it's very concerning, the Journal of the American Medical Association. And most people don't know that my co-author, Bob Baloh at UCLA, he is one of the top neurologists in the world on the vestibular system. And when JAMA were given that study, that's who they went to first. They went to Bob Baloh and they gave him the study and they asked him, what do you think about this? And he reviewed it and he rejected it. And they published it anyway. And the other thing Bob said to me was, he said, you know, in the course of my career, and Bob's about 80 now, he said, I've reviewed about 1,000 articles in peer-reviewed journals. And they always give you the other reviewers' comments. It's part of the peer review process. There's only once that didn't happen. That was with JAMA. They never showed him the other reviews. And you have to ask yourself the question, was there another reviewer or reviewers for that study? And look, when they published it, they beat it up. They had another commentary in there, an editorial that was somewhat critical of the study. And then there was a medical journalist who was very critical of the study. So maybe they thought it was good publicity and we'll put this out there even though it's flawed. And I can't answer for them. But what I do know is I would challenge any journalist out there to go to the JAMA editors and ask them, do you think the 2018 and 2019 studies were good science? Do you still support them? And they can't. They could not come out and say that. They'll give you no comment because they weren't good studies. They were seriously flawed. And it's concerning. And what's even more concerning, because journals do get things wrong occasionally, but what's more concerning is how this got all played up in the media. One of my first careers was as a radio journalist, and it really is alarming to me how media outlets like 60 Minutes can report. It's deception by omission. That's what 60 Minutes did. And they should be called out for deceptive journalism. There's no other way to describe it, really. Deception by omission by 60 Minutes. I would love to be interviewed by 60 Minutes and give the other side, but they didn't give the other side. And, you know, and to finish that story with a woman that felt dizzy and she heard this high-pitched sound, well, transient tinnitus, vestibular issues, about 40% of adults will have some type of vestibular issue with their and spatial awareness. And it's not uncommon. And that's what that woman had. I mean, it was a pretty standard case. And so the issue for me is why these news outlets are just giving the one side. And the only explanation I come up with is clicks and views are more important than the truth in trying to give a balanced report. And it's concerning.
This, I feel, leads right into Bruce Haggard's question. Thank you. He wants to know, how do you explain scientists reporting very obviously non-rational explanations as they did in the Havana Syndrome? So you just laid out, what the media and them not being responsible, but what is the complicity and what are scientists? What is their part in this? And does it again just come down to scientists aren't some sort of exalted other beings? They are human as well. But I don't want to put the answer in your mouth. I'm asking Bruce's question.
Well, you can be my spokesperson as well, there, because that's pretty good explanation. And yeah, and look, scientists are human beings. They make mistakes like everyone else, and you do get scientists disagreeing with different interpretations of evidence. But here's the thing: if you look at the 2018 and 2019 JAMA studies, any scientist, any neurologist worth their salt who looks at those studies would know that they're poor studies and they're seriously flawed. And the other aspect here is, I think a lot of people haven't taken the time to look at the JAMA studies. I had a scientist from my own university recently saying to me, "Oh, you were interviewed recently on Havana Syndrome. I saw an article in one of these major newspapers, and they seem to think it could be some type of microwave weapon. Do you really know what you're talking about?" And I said, "Look, I'll send you a copy of my book." "Oh, sorry, I don't have time to read it." "Well, too bad. If you don't have time to read it and you're criticizing me, then too bad." It's very clear. The people that I know, the neurologists that I know, and I know many, and psychiatrists who have taken the time to read our book and to familiarize themselves with the arguments, are all on the mass psychogenic illness side. It's just a matter, part of the issue is you see JAMA and it's like, oh, it must be true. There was a very well-known scientist who was a specialist in psychosomatic medicine, who's out of that area now and he's into a different area. And he initially was very believing in that there was some type of microwave weapon. It must be true because he had heard that there was an article in JAMA. And that was his basis. And I said, have a closer look at the study. And now they're more skeptical of this whole thing. And it's a matter of taking the time to look at the evidence. Don't let the journalists decide for you. But I do have to say, in the last 6 months, there's been a wave of skepticism because people are finally taking the time to look at these studies and looking at this closer and not just assuming what they've been told is true. And look, there are a small number of scientists, people who have PhDs, who are claiming that something very unusual has been taking place. They are the outliers. I can cherry pick for you. I can go out and I can find you an anthropologist who believes in Bigfoot. I can look, John Mack at Harvard University, very well respected. He believed prior to his death that there were people out there who were being abducted by space aliens, right? You can always find a scientist out there who believes in global warming. But the overwhelming consensus of the scientific community is that global warming is real. It's being driven by human behavior and human beings. And the same here with Havana Syndrome. You can always find experts to come out and give, some other explanation for what's going on. For example, David Relman, who was the head of the National Academy of Sciences panel, which concluded that it was the most likely explanation was pulse microwave radiation. David Relman is a microbiologist, and he is very good at microbiology. He is not an expert in the vestibular system. He keeps coming out and saying things like, well, there was clearly vestibular system damage. Not according to Bob Baloh, who is the expert on the vestibular system. And so the problem also becomes people who are experts who are outside of their field. And while we're on the issue of the National Academy of Sciences, people would think, oh, it must be true. It's the National Academy of Sciences. Not so.
Yeah.
The head of the National Academy of Sciences, David Relman, I watched an interview with him, and he said a lot of the research they conducted by their panel, it was conducted during the lockdown, and it was open sourced. It was stuff they found online that was publicly available to reach the conclusions they did. People often think, oh, they had access to all these secret documents and things like this. And look, they didn't interview myself. They didn't interview Bob Baloh. They didn't interview Sergio Della Sella at the University of Edinburgh, who's been very critical as well. And why not? Why didn't they interview us? And a number of the people they interviewed are outliers, like Beatrice Golo at, she's a medical specialist at the University of San Diego. She is not a mainstream scientist. Am I calling her a quack? No, but she's not a mainstream scientist. She was at a conference that I was involved with, and I asked her what she thought of the mass psychogenic illness explanation. She said that she didn't believe in the existence of mass psychogenic illness. That is not a mainstream position. After that, I said, I'm sorry, I have no further questions. And so with the National Academy of Sciences, people see that and they assume it must be true. Now, one of the things they did in their report cited me a number of times as an expert in mass psychogenic illness. Fine, so they're aware of my research with Bob Baloh and alone individually as well. So they're aware of the research, yet they said in there that mass psychogenic illness was a plausible potential explanation. However, that there was zero information, zero data on the early epidemiological spread in Cuba. None. Not true. That report came out. The National Academy of Sciences report came out in December of 2020. Our book came out, Havana Syndrome, in May of 2020, more than half a year earlier. And in our book, we clearly outline the early epidemiological spread from the intelligence officers to the diplomats, the American embassy to the Canadian embassy. They ignored that. How is it possible that a committee whose only job is to investigate Havana Syndrome doesn't look at or somehow doesn't see the only book that's been published on the subject by reputable mainstream scientists? How is that possible? How did they not know about our book? And by the way, the person who commissioned that panel, Mark Cohen at the State Department, he was a State Department doctor. I made him aware because he contacted me. I made him aware the book was coming out. So they would have known. And so how is that possible? I'd like to ask David Relman that. How you did not know that and we're not aware of that. And Tim Golden and Sebastian Rotella for ProPublica. They had outlined the early epidemiological spread in a couple of articles that came out well before the National Academy of Sciences study, that were public knowledge, that were very well publicized. How come they ignored that as well? And the only person that can answer that is David Relman. But here's the other interesting aspect here. The studies that have come out, it's confusing to people when you see all these studies coming out. It's like, this study says this, that study says that. What's going on here? You had the study come out with the Jason report, these elite scientists that have been consultants to the State Department, Department of Defense. They do these confidential studies, these classified studies, and they make them aware of their conclusions. So you had the FBI report and the Jason study of elite scientists. That came out 2017, 2018, and they were kept classified. And in fact, those reports and what were in those reports were not made public until fairly recently. And the Jason report wasn't released under the Freedom of Information Act until about September of 2021. The FBI report's never been released, but it was leaked. And so you've got this out there. And Congress people would have been familiar with the conclusions of these classified reports. They would have had access to it. Yet they would have known that the FBI report concluded it was mass psychogenic illness, not microwaves. They would have known that the Jason report said it was extremely unlikely it was microwaves, and mass psychogenic illness appears to have played a major role. But that was kept hidden until very recently, when the FOIA request came out and the Jason report came out, and the FBI report still hasn't come out, although the results have been leaked. And then more recently, you had the CIA report earlier this year come out. The main CIA came out and they said, well, their conclusion is the vast majority of over 1,000 reports were anxiety and just an array of common ailments that have been redefined under a new heading. And there was no evidence that it was some kind of foreign weapon. Now, just a few days after the main CIA report came out earlier this year, the small advisory panel commissioned by the CIA of outsiders came out and concluded and made a big deal out of this. It was a big deal in the media, that they concluded it was pulse microwave radiation. So you've got all these studies out there that the government has initiated by major agencies like the FBI and the CIA, who have massive resources, massive intelligence. But you've got the only two that reached the conclusion it was pulse microwave radiation, something other than psychology. What do they have in common? The 2020 National Academy of Sciences study panel and the small advisory panel with the CIA earlier this year. What do they have in common? They both concluded it was most likely pulse microwave radiation from some kind of foreign actor. And the head of both of those panels were David Relman. That's what they have in common. I would suggest to you that David Relman is the outlier. What horse am I betting on? I'm betting on the CIA and all of their resources and all of their documentation and all of their information. I'm betting on the FBI and all of their resources and documentation. I'm not betting on someone who's not a specialist in the area and who's not interviewing myself or Bob Baloh or other experts who are mainstream scientists. And just like you had made, I want to make a point here, and that is, you had mentioned that people get stuck in a position and you try to defend it. Well, the National Academy of Sciences received a lot of heat for their findings under David Relman. And so David Relman gets another chance with this small advisory panel with the CIA, comes out with the same conclusion. I would suggest to you that he's the outlier and that he needs to be more objective.
Robert, I think we're going to have to leave it there because we're a little bit past the hour, but I would be remiss if I did not mention, and Robert Palmer, thank you for sharing this. I'm putting this link in for everyone. You were interviewed for Skeptical Inquirer article about Havana Syndrome, Fact or Fiction was the title of it. And there's a link to the video interview that he did with you if folks want more than what we've done here to get some more information. And I want to thank you so much for your time. I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions, but this has been very informative and very thorough. And I want to remind anyone that if you've missed any of this presentation, it has been recorded and will be available for you tomorrow to catch up, rewatch, and share at skepticalinquirer.org. And as always, my thanks to Skeptical Inquirer, the Center for Inquiry, tonight's producer, Mike Powell, with technical assist from Alice Pine. And again, Robert, thank you so much for being with us. And of course, thank you to everyone in the audience who chose to spend your time with us, or if you're watching on video, we're grateful for you as well. Thank you, everyone. I'm Leanne Lord. Have a good night. Robert, well, good morning.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
All right. Bye, everyone.